I'm Ken Rockwell. Let's look at Nikon's latest ZF full-frame mirrorless camera. Everyone who owns this, other than me, thinks it's the best camera ever because it feels great. It's almost all metal. It looks like they're classic cameras. It's actually just a little bit bigger than, here's my classic Nikon FM. How do we do this? Nikon FM is actually, from 1977, is a little bit smaller, but it's very similar. Nikon's trying to rest on their laurels here. For instance, this all-plastic crummy lens here, which has great optics, but it's all plastic, is styled to look like, here's my 35mm f2 AIS lens. The differences are, the reason I'm not that excited about the ZF is ergonomics are not up to snuff. It's not as easy to use because it's made to look cool rather than work cool. You've got a shutter speed dial. Who in the world needs that? We do that electronically today. On this dial instead should be your exposure modes and also your preset modes for user 1, user 2, user 3 that recall everything about the camera. I shouldn't have to do this over here. This dial is relatively useless because it doesn't have the lower settings or the higher settings for ISO, so you still have to go to the menus. And worst of all, I have to use a second hand to select the exposure mode. You're going to be kidding me. I like to have a mode button here like came out in the F5 back in the 90s to change exposure mode. These buttons are too tiny. They're all over here, and I constantly have to pull back in. And I don't want to have to reach all the way down here. There should be more controls here, but there aren't. You'll notice what it's styled after was this camera. Back in the day, we didn't put controls here because we didn't have any controls to put there. Everything happens right here where your thumb was. You could advance, turn off the meter, set the exposure. Real easy, just like that. So I find this camera's biggest vice is its usability. It sacrifices usability for the sake of looking cool. For instance, this looks like a real live cable release socket, and it is a cable release socket, but guess what? When you put a cable release in there, it doesn't work. It's a scam. It doesn't really work. This little LCD screen, which is smaller than an LCD watch from the 1970s, actually is supposed to mimic the old frame counter. This is relatively useless because you can't see it. Even here on the studio lighting, good luck. Nothing much going on there. But hey, let's take a look at some of the pictures. The reason people love this too is it's state of the art. The technical quality of the images is superb. Here's a Packard. It's shot with the 70 to 180 millimeter f2.8 at 125 millimeters at a 4.5 at a 3/20th at auto ISO 100. Here's a sunset. Never can go wrong with sunsets. Shot with the 70 to 180 millimeter f2.8 at 81 millimeters f6.3 at 1/1000th of a second at auto ISO 110. The ZF has most of the guts and performance of the Nikon Z6 Mark II. It's just put in a more stylish but less functional body. The sensor, the frame rate, the shutter, the finder, the touchscreen specifications are all identical to 2020 Z6 Mark II. So ignore Nikon's claims that it's a Z8. No, it's not a Z8 in any shape, manner, or form. What's new is thank goodness, Nikon finally got on board. You can set the menus properly, and I have all that at my website, kenrockwell.com. I have a complete user's guide where while your eye is to the finder, you can be using your finger here to set and select the focus points, which the Nikon cameras hasn't been able to do before. They required us click around with this thing like a little idiot, like it's 1970s or playing Space Invaders or something. No, you just move your finger here. That's the way most of the other brands of cameras have let us do it. That's a significant improvement, this. What's nice, too, is that the data displays rotate. If we have our data here, you'll notice if we're shooting, that rotates when you go vertical. That is nice. It also has a normal flippy screen. The other Nikon cameras have had these ridiculously complicated but relatively pointless mechanics here for moving the screen. It's got the usual flippy screen. So Nikon finally gets with the program for that. There's an easy voice note recorder. Set your menus properly. Again, see my user's guide at kenrockwell.com. And you can just hold one of these buttons when you're watching a playback image play, and you can record audio with it, which is great for taking notes. It's got magnesium alloy top and bottom covers, so they claim. It's got lots of metal with engraved markings, which is nice. And again, it's a poser camera. It looks great, but I find the usability really suffers. Bad is the exposure mode lever is on the wrong side of the camera. I don't use the ISO dial. When you set it to C, that means you control it inside the cameras. So in other words, you're controlling it like every other camera in a menu. Having to use a second hand for this, I usually shoot one-handed, so I don't like having to use a second hand to go off and change my exposure mode. It does not have 4x3 or 4x5 ideal format crops. That's a big one for me, as I oftentimes shoot in that, especially vertically, when the 3:2 skinny rectangle is just too vertical. The FTZ adapter is relatively useless. For instance, when you shoot one of these lenses, you don't get full aperture focusing and instant stop down when you press the shutter. You don't get aperture coupling into the EXIF data. The FTZ is a dud. Also, the FTZ will not focus with any of the earliest autofocus lenses that use a screw-type mechanical connection that requires there to be a focus motor in the camera. So if you're thinking of using your classic AIS lenses, this is not the camera to do it. It's a poser camera. This is styled to look like an AIS lens, has nothing in common with it. If you want to shoot AIS lenses, the smart thing is make sure to get a DSLR. A full-frame DSLR has all the coupling to couple properly to a manual focus lens. Also, one of my whines is, everyone has a different opinion, the shutter is not protected when you turn off the camera, and there's not a menu for that, at least as of current, which means this is a great camera when it's brand new, but the problem is when it gets on, you're going to get dirt in there. Also, what's weird is, and a lot of cameras are like this, it has sensor shift stabilization. When you turn the camera off, let me turn it on. You see how the sensor moved? It's now relatively locked down. If I turn it off, the sensor just drops and there's nothing really holding it in. A lot of Sonys are like that, so that's just the way it is. If you think your camera's defective, no, that's just normal. Production's dumped to Thailand. This is not a Japanese-made camera. What's missing? Core incompetency of Nikon is you cannot get a color RGB histogram while you're shooting. You can only get that on playback. I keep saying it because it drives me up the wall. The user presets really important to me because I set one for landscapes, one for people, and one for sports, and everything I change about the camera comes up as I change the user mode. Right now, it doesn't do that. If I go from shooting one kind of assignment to another, or if I'm shooting sports and suddenly need to go shoot a landscape because something, a cloud comes by that looks cool, it's a real pain because a million different things I need to set, like finder brightnesses, auto ISO ranges, auto ISO minimum shutter speeds, saturation, sharpness, all that stuff. That I'm missing. That's a real problem for me. But hey, that's why Nikon makes so many cameras. So again, if you don't like it, buy something else. Autofocus is not great. This is pretty good as Nikon's go, but honestly, I've never been a fan of Nikon's mirrorless autofocus system. Manual focus does work great. It's got instant manual focus override. So for instance, on this lens, it just works. Other brands of cameras like my Canons can do it, but it takes a bunch of menu fiddling, and Sony's too never really get it right. Nikon's just get it right. Even if you're in continuous autofocus mode, just grab this manual focus ring and it'll change the focus and keep it that way. Let's look at some high ISO samples. And you can download the original files at my website, kenrockwell.com, where if you're really serious about this camera, you can get all the complete data. Now, as we're going up in ISO, and again, I have on the website, I have crops and enlargements and so forth, it makes pretty much the same pictures as we go up in ISO, which all cameras do. The thing is, if you magnify it a lot, they'll get softer at high ISOs, but they don't really start looking bad until we get to the very highest ISOs. And what's a little weird is ISO 102,400 is H plus 07, and 204,800 ISO is H plus 1.7. The reason for that is Nikon oddly considers that ISO 64,000 is a standard ISO. It doesn't go to 51,200 and then push and even stops from there. It goes to ISO 64,000 and then pushes from there. So the maximum push isn't H plus 2, it's actually H plus 1.7. So potato, make fun of me all you want, but admittedly, it took me a while to figure out what was going on here. So there you go, that's your answer. Mechanically, the camera feels pretty nice. What's made out of metal is the strap lugs, the top cover, the ISO dial, the top center cover, the hot shoe, the shutter speed dial, the on-off switch, the shutter button, the compensation dial, the lens mount, the lens release button, this little dude over here, the front function button, which is this little guy down here, the tripod plots, which is this area here, and the tripod socket. Now notice on top I said they claimed magnesium alloy bottom cover. No. What's plastic is the exposure mode lever, which is this over here, the front cover plate with the Nikon logo above the lens, which is that there, this black and white still or movie mode lever here, the red button near the shutter release is plastic, the front and rear main control dials, which are these crummy little things. These things are plastic. The front cover is plastic. The left side connector fascia, this here, that's plastic. The LCD frame is plastic. The camera back cover is plastic. All the buttons and knobs I haven't mentioned are plastic. The bottom cover, this is plastic. This door is plastic, that's plastic. Battery in the car door is all plastic, although there is a little bit of metal here. Glass are the eyepiece optics and the LCD cover. Rubber eyes are the connector covers and the fake leather grip material. And the serial number is printed on a sticker on the back, which is a pretty crummy way to do it. But since this isn't going to get beaten up for the most part, I'll give them a pass on that. So when they put it on the bottom of the camera as a sticker, then that's not really acceptable. The battery runs just fine. The only gotcha is it tends not to shut off automatically. In other words, it'll see me with the camera around my neck and think that I'm actually shooting with it and keep the camera turned on. And then what happens is I go back to the camera half an hour later and the whole camera's warm and I've lost like half my battery charge. So you need to be careful with that. But in a nutshell, that's a quick review of the Nikon ZF. For the full review, see kenrockwell.com. Here on kenrockwell.tv, use my search box or just use the links in my description and you can get right to it. Thanks again for watching Ken Rockwell here on kenrockwell.tv.